Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Fide Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Fide Chat at fide.email. Technology without compromise.
So I gave you the good news story a few days ago of data showing that young priests and seminarians are much more conservative than their elders. We have a whole slew of priests right now retiring. It's happening in large numbers. Those priests who are retiring are priests who would have been ordained during or just after the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council. These were priests who were much more progressive than those who came before them. They very much were a part of the spirit of Vatican II. If you've ever gotten bad advice from a priest in the confessional about how seriously to take sins of the flesh or any sin that's of a habitual nature, since most people confess 2 or 3 sins most of the time, most sins are a sin of habit to some degree. And if you've ever gotten a bad piece of bad advice like, oh, that's not that big of a deal of a sin because it's just a habit, whether it's, spending beyond your means or 6th and 9th commandment issues or whatever it is, and they tell you it's not a big deal because it's a habit, go receive communion anyway. That generation of priests are heading into retirement. Now, the problem is they're retiring in larger numbers than there are seminarians and younger priests to replace them. But on the upside, the priests we're getting, despite all the institutional blockages to them, are much more conservative than those who came before. That's good news. I covered that in depth the other day. Not everybody's taking it to be good news, as you might expect. In fact, I think the most nakedly blatant modernist English language outlet, at least in the United States, has, I think, the most mask-off take about this. And this comes to us from a National Catholic Reporter, because of course it does, with the headline, "While out of sync with lay Catholics, conservative young priests are the future of the U.S. Church." This is written by Father Thomas Reese, F.J., Pastor Tommy Reese of the Jesuit Church. And strictly speaking, in this headline, he is not wrong. The priests that we're getting are much more conservative than the laity. The laity, according to most, at least the voting patterns in the United States, have been drifting to being more conservative. It used to be that Democrats could count on the vote of Catholics at the polls. In the last few elections, Catholics have, on balance, been voting Republican. But it used to be the Democrats had a lock on most Catholic voters. So even the laity are drifting in that direction. But if you poll the typical Catholic who goes to Mass on a regular basis, Pew has done this, CARA, which is a Catholic research organization, they've done this, and they find consistently the same thing, which is, generally speaking, Catholics in the pews who go to Mass on a regular basis, which is often defined as once or twice a month, by the way. Pro tip, if you're going to Mass only once or twice a month, don't receive communion because you need to be going every Sunday, because if you miss Mass on Sunday without a good reason, like illness, or maybe the weather is so bad that you can't get to Mass safely, something like that. If you're missing Mass for an illegitimate reason, it's a mortal sin. It is. So don't receive if you're in that boat. But those who go to Mass at least once or twice a month, on average, disagree with the Church's teaching on morality, on anything you want to come to grips with. The highest profile things are James Martin parody of holy matrimony and contraception. Those are the 2 big ones, and then the sacrifice to Moloch as a close third. The more often they go to Mass, the more likely they are to adhere to Church teaching on this. This should shock no one. We know there is grace in receiving the Eucharist. And one of the graces in receiving the Eucharist regularly is probably helping you to understand what the Church teaches, if I had to guess. Now, on the flip side of that, traditional Catholics tend to go to Mass very regularly and agree with the Church's teaching at upwards of 90% or higher, 98% on most of those issues. But Pastor Tommy here is not wrong, that these young priests are going to be out of step with the laity. And that's a good thing, because if you want to fix that issue, of the laity rejecting the church as moral authority, you get priests who know how to communicate what the church teaches, how to teach it in a way that is pastorally appropriate, but also doesn't shy away from the truth. To tell people that those things that they defend, that they do in their lives, are actually sins. That the church teaches us the truth about morality, and that no, these are not optional teachings of the church. Your quote unquote informed conscience doesn't allow you to override church teaching, because most of the time people invoke their personal conscience, and it's a malformed conscience. They violate the church's teachings and think that they know better than the church because they then invoke science or something. But anyway, here's Pastor Tommy posting a picture of if you've never seen an ordination, especially in a more conservative or traditionalist environment, you should absolutely go. It is a mind-blowing experience. He posts here a picture from 13 men being ordained to the priesthood in May of 2024 at the Cathedral of St. Paul in Minnesota. That's what he has to say. For decades, older priests have complained about conservative younger priests who have been coming out of seminaries in recent years. Well, those younger priests have complained about old liberal priests. The views of younger priests are especially important because they are the future of the American church. Us old guys are dying off. Again, Thomas Reese said that. A priest said that, not me. The 2025 National Study of Catholic Priests, released this month by the Catholic Project of the Catholic University of America, gives us data on which to reflect as the church faces its future. When priests were asked by the project to describe their political views, the responses show an increase in political conservatism among younger generations of priests. The change began in 1980, the year Ronald Reagan was elected, and continued to grow over time, no matter who was president. Among those ordained before 1975, 61% identified as very or somewhat liberal, and less than 15% as conservative, the study reports. Among those ordained since 2010, nearly half identify as very or somewhat conservative, and only about 1 in 10 as liberal. The political leanings of younger and older priests are the reverse of those of the Catholic population at large, where the older generations are more conservative than the younger. Of Catholics aged 65 and older, 43% describe themselves as conservative, while only 26% under 30 say the same, according to data provided to me by Public Religion Research Institute based on their 2024 study of partisanship among Catholic voters. That organization also has 25% of American Catholics under 50 identifying as liberal. These young priests, in other words, are even more conservative than Catholics 65 and older. And then he gives you here this chart to really, I'd have to zoom out, but, ordained before 75, ordained 2010 or later, and then you can just see the split. More and more conservative, using the weirdly American red versus blue color schema, which if you're watching this outside the United States, in your mind, red usually means socialists and labor parties, and blue typically means the conservative and monarchist parties. But in America, we reverse it because we associate red with communism, and the networks and the Democrats did not want to be associated with that because that would be truth in advertising. But anyway, according to the National Priest Study, the priest theological views followed a similar pattern across generations, though with an even sharper decline in progressivism and a stronger consolidation on the conservative side. Thus, theological views revealed an even sharper polarization than political views. Among priests ordained before 1975, more than 70% described themselves as theologically progressive, while in the 2010 or later cohort, only 8% did so, the report says. In other words, let's repeat that. Basically, 3/4 of priests ordained before 1975, the cohort retiring right now, were progressive. Those coming out of the seminaries right now, only 8% are. Those of you who watch this channel for a long time will remember that at one point I reported that my own sources told me that even the Jesuits are concerned about this because the men they're ordaining are actually Jesuits. They're not part of the Jesuit church. They're actually Jesuit priests of the Catholic Church. They're sons of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Young Jesuits are, on balance, much more conservative than the ones who are helping wreck the church right now. They say, you may have heard the phrase demographics is destiny. Well, in the church, it certainly is true. If most of the priests are conservative, then it's just a matter of time, which might give you insight as to why Rome is actively crushing the traditional mass right now. as well as pushing so hard for synodality. What better way to counter the influence of priests than to give laity an increased voice in the decision-making process, to authorize laity to govern dioceses and parishes? In Germany, they're actually trying to put laity in charge of dioceses, laity in charge of who gets to become a bishop, laity in charge of who gets ordained to the priesthood, laity in charge of who gets sent to seminary. What better way to prevent this reality from happening than to put laity in charge? You want to know what the biggest threat to the inevitable is? It's the synodal revolution. And of course, the consequences if the synodalists get their way is you have very few priests. They seem not to care that much about that. It's not difficult to explain where this conservative streak came from. After Pope John Paul II was elected in 1978, seminaries became more conservative as John Paul appointed conservative bishops. He also appointed Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger to head the Vatican Doctrine Office. Ratzinger cracked down on progressive theologians, chasing them out of seminaries. Some bishops are trying to turn their seminaries around. The Archbishop of Detroit, for example, has removed 3 professors who publicly criticized Pope Francis and his teachings. Note here, Pastor Tommy Reese, FJ, is saying that the new Archbishop of Detroit is trying to turn around his seminary, meaning stop the conservative bent of the seminary. He had 3 conservative by post-conciliar standard seminary professors, some of whom have very well-known names, so well-known that the typical lay Catholic who doesn't pay attention to this stuff may have heard their name. That well-known. Fired them for being conservative, essentially. He continues saying, such reforms, if they happen, only impact future generations of priests, meaning there might be more liberal priests coming down the pike later. As a result of the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, it is not surprising that over 70% of younger priests describe themselves as conservative Orthodox or very conservative Orthodox, leaving only about 1 in 5 in the middle of the road, according to the Catholic Project. Once again, the theological views of younger priests are out of sync with their peers and with the Catholic population. Catholics tend to favor progressive views on married priests, the James Martin's parody of holy matrimony, communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, and the use of contraceptives. As a result, in the coming decades, Catholic clergy will be even more out of sync with lay Catholics than the clergy is today. And I'm going to ask you this basic question. How much of Catholic moral teaching can you get away with rejecting? Saying that the church is wrong? Before you're not even a Catholic anymore, you have to ask yourself that. These are timeless teachings, although this issue, James Martin's parody of holy matrimony, nobody would have ever thought society would go that far off the deep end to allow that. It was just so far out of the realm of possibility. More than 30 years ago, go back further than 30 years ago, people would have thought that if you told them this was going to happen, they would have probably thought you lost it completely. But how much of this becomes a deal breaker before you've essentially apostatized without realizing it? Let me know your thought on that in the comments. It's not something I have an easy answer for. Some argue for ignoring the views of Catholics who aren't in church most Sundays, who skew less conservative than Catholics who attend Mass weekly. Yet even 40% of weekly Mass attenders support the ordination of women, according to Pew Research Center. Note what I said earlier. The more often you go to Mass, if you go to Mass regularly, when you're supposed to, every Sunday and every holy day of obligation, the more actually Catholic you become, the more in line your views become with those of the church. 40% of weekly Mass attenders support the ordination of women. That should be setting off alarm bells for most people, because I would say on this issue, you believe that, you're not a Catholic anymore. Because you believe the church got something as fundamental to the faith as who can be ordained to the priesthood, which has to do with the metaphysical nature of men and women. You believe you got that wrong, then you've rejected the church as a teaching authority on even theology, let alone morality. And morality and theology, of course, have huge overlaps anyway. He continues saying, in addition, more than half of weekly churchgoers favor allowing Catholics to use birth control, 72%, and in vitro fertilization, 71%, allowing unmarried couples who live together to go to communion, 59%, and allowing women to become deacons, 54%. Again, how many of these things can you believe before you stop being a Catholic? I don't have the answer to that question. All this is currently not allowed by the church. Note his use of the word currently, as if all of those things can be changed. These things here, the life issues, are constant teachings of the church. There's an ancient book called the Didache. It's like the first catechism the church ever produced. We're talking first century, and it was against any of these kinds of things. Now, obviously, IVF didn't exist then, but there certainly were methods for contracepting and for, stopping the process in its tracks afterwards. The sacrifice to Moloch, and that document unequivocally rejects those things. We're talking apostolic times teaching, and they reject that. And then, of course, there's that. Scripture tells you not to do that. In any case, writing off Catholics who do not go to Mass weekly would be devastating for the church. As older progressive priests retire or die, younger conservative priests will have a profound impact on parish life. When given a list of pastoral issues and asked what should be the priorities of the church, priests of all generations agreed on such issues as youth and young adult ministry, family formation and marriage prep and evangelization, but there was less consensus on other issues. Quoting the survey, on issues such as the thermometer problem, you're not allowed to criticize that on YouTube, immigration, James Martin's issues, poverty, disliking people because of the content of their flesh, social justice, and synodality prioritization diminishes as age goes down. So all of your left-wing, Democratic Party platform issues are far less important to younger priests. It is the opposite in the case of the Eucharist devotion and access to the TLM. So in other words, worshiping the Jesus Christ truly present in the Eucharist is more important than these issues for actually Catholic priests. This is my shocked face. Okay. And access to the TLM, meaning having the ability to worship in the same manner that our ancestors had in the Latin West, going back to antiquity. Okay. Yeah. You get the idea. These are the alarm bells Pastor Tommy Reese of the Jesuit Church is ringing. All we have to do is wait them out. But remember, what is the point of synodality? To increase lay participation in the life of the church, including its governance. They have said as much. That is their way of stopping this. They're relying on those 40% who want women's ordination, those 70% who categorically reject the church's authority to teach about morality on all those other issues, to prevent certain kinds of men from becoming priests, even if that means there are so few priests that on Sundays you might have a deaconette who reads to you the readings, gives you the gospel, has you sing a hymn or two, and then gives you communion that was pre-consecrated. You're not going to Mass on a Sunday, you're going to a Eucharistic service. They would rather have that than the Catholic Church remain Catholic. We had this interesting kind of thing that's related. Vatican News was reporting on the ongoing Synod on Synodality, its relationship to the Jubilee year. Under the headline, Jubilee of Synodal Teams, Converting Relationships to be One in Christ. Prior to this past Friday's encounter with Pope Leo, participants in the Jubilee for Synodal Teams and participatory bodies engage in a dialogue in the Paul VI Hall, with leaders discussing hopes for the future, ongoing tensions on the place of synodality in the church and the world. Yes, this happened with the creepy statue behind them. I do hope that one day, shortly after a future pope exorcises St. Peter's Basilica and reconsecrates it, that he has this thing scrapped. This thing is just evil looking. A gaze filled with hope turned toward what will be in the spirit of synodality. Beyond its tensions between I and we, unity and uniformity, preservation and mission, a call for a true conversion of relationships, which becomes social prophecy, denouncing the abyss between social groups and rekindling Jesus' call to be one. These were some of the key themes explored in the opening sessions of the Jubilee of Synodal Teams and Participatory Bodies, held on October 24th in the Paul VI Hall. Speakers included Cardinal Mario Gresh, the head of the Synod on Synodality, Cardinal Gregory Reis, Archbishop of Lodz, Poland, Miguel de Salas Morel, Portuguese theologian and associate professor of ecclesiology at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, and Mariana Aparecida Venancio, member of Brazil's National Animation Commission for the implementation of the Synod. The session was moderated by Bishop Luis Marin de San Martin OSA, Under Secretary of the General Secretariat of the Synod. In his greeting, Cardinal Gresh drew on the Portal of the Mystery of Hope by Charles Piguet, recalling the author's vision of three theological virtues. Faith sees what it is, hope sees what it will be, and love loves what is. A spiritual compass, a framework to reimagine how the church listens, discerns, and walks together. Love, said Gresh, is not merely an emotion, but the posture with which we inhabit the church. It does not wait for perfection, but chooses to embrace reality as it is. It is the decision to remain present, a sign of spiritual maturity, recognizing that unity does not mean uniformity. Love goes hand in hand with faith, the lens through which in the church we see something more than human, something divine. This is not blind optimism, but a clear-eyed view of reality, where the synodal journey begins with radical listening to the cry of those who live on society's margins. Synodality is about all those progressive politics. They say it right there. Be unified together and not calling people to conversion. Go out and make a better world. Cardinal Mario Gresh. He wasn't my sleeper candidate to be Pope. My sleeper candidate was actually nightmare fuel, Cardinal Hollerich. I would have laughed at the conclave if that had happened, if he had been the one who emerged on the loggia, because it would have been not even being subtle about continuing Francis's legacy. At least they were briefly subtle about it for about like 3 months. But now the subtlety's over. Reportedly, by the way, the timing of it, you might remember in September, Pastor Jimmy Martin, Father James Martin of the Jesuit Church, met with Pope Leo. And right afterwards, Leo hit the acceleration, pedal to the metal on synodality, crushing the Latin Mass, all these other things. It became much more obvious for people after that meeting. Now you've heard a term, though. There was a term in that. It was, the spirit of the synod and the spirit of the church and all that stuff was in Mario Gresh's talk there. Lepanto Institute pointed this out. Anytime one speaks about the spirit of Christianity, they're speaking about the ghost of Christianity. Quote from G.K. Chesterton. Always be wary of people who speak about the spirit of that. The other thing you should be wary about, though, is that the spirit of Vatican II. You always hear the people saying the biggest defenders of the radical reforms in the church and the spirit of revolution that we've been subjected to since the 60s. They use the spirit of Vatican II as a way to read a certain way into the Vatican II documents. And I'm not defending those documents at all, but they are certainly reading a lot into them with how they should be implemented in the most radical way as possible. Now, and related to all this, yesterday I covered Pope Leo's remarkable address on Sunday, the Feast of Christ the King on the old calendar, talking about, how no Catholic and the church cannot possess the truth, that the whole point of synodality and ecumenical dialogue is to journey together in search of the truth. That isn't a statement of apostasy. It is, because Jesus said the Holy Spirit will guide the church in spirit and truth, will guide the church to all truth. We possess the truth. Every Catholic who knows the faith at least a little bit, the basics of it, already has the truth. We know it. Well, Archbishop Vigano has some interesting thoughts on this. He says, a little less than 100 years ago, on December 11th, 1925, the Lombard Pontiff Pius XI promulgated the immortal encyclical Quas Primus, which defined the doctrine of the universal kingship of our Lord Jesus Christ. He is king because he is God, and also because he is a descendant of the royal lineage of the tribe of David. And finally, he is king by right of conquest through the redemption. The institution of this feast did not, in truth, introduce anything new. It was established by Pius XI to counter and combat the plague of secular liberalism, the stone-cutter free church in a free state, and the foolish presumption of excluding Jesus Christ from civil society. Pius XI was not the only one to solemnly reaffirm Catholic doctrine. Before him, Clement XII, Benedict XIV, Clement XIII, Pius VI, Pius VII, Leo XII, Pius VIII, Gregory XIV, Pius IX, Leo XIII, and St. Pius X, That would be literally every pope of the order that they served in for more than a century beforehand, had severely condemned secret lodges, carbonari, the stonecutters, and all the errors that the enemies of Christ had spread and fueled over the last 2 centuries. After the great fracture of Protestantism in the 16th century, the following 3 centuries saw the Catholic Church and the anti-church, that is, stonecuttery, clash in a series of terrible battles. On one side, the Prince of Peace and his angelic and earthly hosts. On the other, the Scalesta Turba, the evil crowd, the wretched mob, incited by merchants ensnared to Lucifer. The myth of the sovereign people buried centuries of Christian civilization under the ruins of revolution, demonstrating the extent of the aberrations to which man could go. The martyrs of these centuries of unspeakable violence and still unpunished large-scale endings of human beings looked down on us from their seats in heaven, demanding justice for the blood that was shed. And with their silence, almost a dark night for the church, on the eve of her passion, they watch in disbelief as the popes of these last decades have laid down their spiritual weapons and cooperated with the enemies of Christ. From those seats, the warrior pontiffs also look down on us. They who, even at the cost of their own lives, like Pius VI, imprisoned by Napoleon and dying of the hardships of prison, faced head-on the most ferocious attacks against God, against the papacy, against the Catholic hierarchy, and against the faithful. If history had not been falsified by the temporary victors of this war, as still happens today, our children would be studying in schools not the storming the Bastille, not the lies of the epic of the Risorgimento, not the deeds of conspiring mercenaries or corrupt ministers, but the phases of the large-scale ending of the lives of Catholics of once Christian nations. That is a hot excerpt from his Christ the King homily. I'll have a link to all that in the show notes at the Anthony Stine Substack. Not long after this broadcast is over. I suggest you read it. One of the effects of all of this rejection of the moral authority and the infiltration of the church, is bizarre stories that come into the news. There are men morally unfit to be priests. Usually, when I say it that way, you're thinking of men like Ted McCarrick and Maciel and other monsters who prey on the most vulnerable with disordered desires of the flesh, who are willing to engage in great evil to satiate those unholy desires. But sometimes you get a bizarre turn, like this one. Last story of the day, I go to Catholic Conclave. For this weird story, gotta be careful with this one. Headline, priest convicted after setting up a controlled substances manufacturing kitchen. He's making something that they refer to as crystal. 3 guilty verdicts. If you wonder how you get priests like this, it's the same reason you get priests like James Martin, or priests who do those evil deeds like McCarrick. No, I'm not saying James Martin did those things. It's how you get men who violate their vows. Is you get men like, it's the same way. I would not be shocked if you dug into this priest's background. Well, former priest, so-called former priest. Once a priest, always a priest. He will bear that indelible mark on his soul till he stands before our Lord in judgment, and even wherever his eternal destiny is. It's a mark that cannot be removed. Thus is what happens when a man is ordained, much like when you are baptized. But a former priest here, you get men like this, because I've heard of other stories, not terribly different than this one. You get them for the same reasons you get those other kinds of priests. There was an active attempt to destroy the Catholic Church by ordaining men who shouldn't be there. And once some of those men became in charge of seminaries, once they became in charge of diocesan vocations, and really after they got enough of them as bishops and cardinals in the church, that's how you get men like this in the seminaries. The screening processes used to be a joke. After McCarrick, they got much better in a lot of dioceses. It can be tightened up still. A former priest appeared before the Krenz Regional Court on Thursday with 2 co-defendants. The trio, along with an accomplice, allegedly planned to produce that controlled substance last year. They were not found guilty by a final court decision. The plan allegedly failed due to faulty instructions. In other words, it was a competency issue. One of the accused, a 31-year-old Iraqi, failed to appear at the hearing, and the case against him was dismissed. Yeah, okay, Europe. The 3 men president pleaded guilty to illicit handling of these controlled substance precursors at the beginning of a single judge hearing. The priest received a 22-month suspended sentence, with 19 months suspended. I like America's hard-on-crime approach to these things. A man like this should be in jail for a very long time. In addition to the 39-year-old who previously served as a priest in the Val d'Ivertel region and now works as an insurance advisor, 2 Czech nationals, each 24 years old, appeared in court. One of the 2 received a partially suspended sentence of 15 months, 13 of which were suspended. The other received a 6-month suspended sentence. The several months of pretrial detention last year will be credited to each of the men, meaning they will no longer have to serve in prison. The defendants waived their right to appeal. Because the public prosecutor did not file a statement, the verdicts are not final. The priest is alleged to have ordered these ingredients, specifically 10 liters of certain kinds of ingredients to make these nasty, nasty controlled substances. I mean, look what's in them. Why would you ever put that in your body? He bought these things online in June and July of 2024, together with one of the 24-year-olds. After delivering to a parcel station in the Czech Republic, the substances were picked up and taken to the Val d'Ivertel region to produce 1 kilo of that product, according to the criminal complaint. According to the indictment, the substances were stored in the 39-year-old's parsonage, meaning his home. Attempts to produce that product are also said to have taken place there on July 13th and from July 20th to 21. After the production failed, the 31-year-old is said to have stored the chemicals in his apartment. Because of course he would. Because if you're dumb enough to try to produce that stuff in the first place, you're probably dumb enough to try to live with that stuff. I am originally from the Portland metro area, Portland, Oregon. Political, cultural refugee. That part of the country's got a problem with a very severe problem with the material, with that substance that he was trying to produce. And it wasn't that unusual of a sight. If you were in the rural areas, or even in some urban areas, or suburban areas, anywhere you could go for a police raid involving men in chemical hazmat suits. Not that unusual. For a time, it was so bad that, yeah, you might do a double take when you saw it if you were riding a bus or driving somewhere, but it wasn't that unusual. But this was a man who had been a priest, who somehow didn't set off any red flags. He was 39 years old. For those who don't know, the ordination process, it says, from the time you start seminary to the time you're ordained can take anywhere from 6 to 9 years. And that means, you can be ordained as young as, I think it's 27. It wasn't that long ago. And there's checks along the way to make sure you're fit to be ordained. It wasn't really that long ago in the grand scheme of things that man had been ordained a priest. You'd think there might have been some red flags in the process. I would go have a look, if I were investigators, into that diocesan vocations office to see what they find. You want to know how you get this in the church? It's playing fast and loose with Catholic morality, not applying it in the strictest sense to those who are entering seminary. Oftentimes, seminaries or vocations directors' offices are run by men who are into the same things that James Martin has expressed interests in. From there, you get a bunch of dominoes that fall down. Curious what you think about this. And we got a bunch of Breaking Bad references in the live chat, because of course we do. I've never even seen that show, but I recognize the references. I am curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments. Please pray for that priest, that former priest, former with an asterisk. That man will have bear the mark of a priest of Christ on his soul for the rest of time. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps a lot too. Please pray for the church. And I know that's an unbelievable story. I'm still, having read that article a few times, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around the reality of it. But please pray for him. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.